Thank you all for coming to my talk. So just to put this into context, this has been the start of my PhD work, which I've been doing this particular piece of work up until just before Christmas. I've had some time to kind of write that up, and I'm giving another seminar in a few weeks to a more purely epidemiological audience, so I'd appreciate kind of any feedback. So yeah, I'll be talking to you today about how should lockdown be introduced, devising cost-effective strategies for novel outbreaks amid vaccine uncertainty. So to begin, this project is motivated by the recent COVID-19 pandemic, particularly how there was a stark contrast between how different countries applied non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, think your strict social distancing measures, to mitigate or suppress the impact of the outbreak. So you've got your countries like China and Australia who adopted very zero COVID elimination-based strategies, and that contrasted heavily with our own experience here in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. So what was particularly important at the time, as policymakers sat down and made urgent decisions in spring 2020, was there was a lot of uncertainty regarding future outcomes, particularly around the development of a vaccine. As in, without a vaccine, we have to rely on these strict social distancing measures, which we know are quite costly. So this uncertainty regarding the timing and development of a vaccine could have been influencing policy. Now, mathematical modeling has come a long way in order to provide evidence and inform policy decision-making. But in order for policymakers to make the best use out of that, they need to be clear in communicating and justifying any objectives they have for introducing interventions. So this bit of work is more of a kind of a proof of concept that objectives matter. So we'll look at how the optimal control policy is contingent on the objective function and how uncertainty regarding the vaccine development could influence strategies to adopt at the beginning of the outbreak. So I'll introduce my model. It's an SIR deterministic compartmental model used to simulate outbreaks of a novel pathogen. So it's age structured. So we've three age cohorts, 0 to 19, 20 to 64, 65 plus. And that's to kind of incorporate heterogeneity and age dependent severity outcomes. So we have 4 infectious classes. So at the end of the latent period, individuals can either be asymptomatic, symptomatic, or symptomatic with severe disease requiring hospitalization. I've also included the force of infection term in the bottom left, so those tau and rho parameters are less than 1. Here we're assuming that asymptomatic individuals are less infectious due to a lower viral load, and hospitalized individuals carry fewer contacts through ward isolation, while still allowing for some degree of nosocomial transmission. So then, wrapping around my model, I have this control protocol. So at any point in this model simulations, a policymaker can be in one of 3 control states. So we have no control, where the disease spreads as normal, and 2 tiers of control, each with a reduction in transmission associated with them. So switching between these control states is determined by 4 switching thresholds, and these will be based on the number of people in hospital with severe disease. So I'm going to incorporate some constraints. So a policymaker must spend a minimum duration in each control state before they're allowed to relax or reintroduce measures. And then we're also going to have a delay from a policymaker deciding on a new control state and its implementation. So this can kind of reflect any logistical bottlenecks or the public adapting to changes in policy messaging. I'll also note, if the epidemic is growing very rapidly, we can jump straight from no control to lockdown, but not the other way around. So to fully relax, you have to visit the intermediate control state intermittently. So now I'm going to vary my switching thresholds to define 4 unique control strategies, and each of these are defined to guide the epidemic according to a given principle. So cautious easing has low thresholds to relax, but a high threshold to enter lockdown. So we want to minimize the number of phases spent in lockdown. Suppression strategy has low thresholds throughout, so the prevalence is going to be lower for this scenario. However, this will come at the cost of maintaining these stringent social distancing measures. Slow control has a high threshold to enter lockdown and a high threshold to relax as well. So this anticipates that after a few short periods in lockdown, we reach a point early where the intermediate control state is sufficient in avoiding any resurgence. And then lastly, rapid control, narrow gaps between moderately high switching thresholds. So this allows for a lot of flexibility to move from no control to lockdown and vice versa, but the prevalence is going to be higher throughout this control strategy. So now I'll introduce my objective function I use to evaluate control strategies at daily outputs along the model simulations. So it has three main components. This first component is a measure of disease burden, with HT being the number of new hospitalizations on a given day. The second variable is a control variable, UT, which is the relative reduction in transmission on a given day. I'm going to give this a nonlinear contribution. So we're going to assume that lockdown is disproportionately costlier for the policymaker to implement, because this would require much more stringent social distancing, such as the closure of workplaces and schools. So I'm going to normalize these so they vary on the same scale. And then we have this weighting coefficient W, which acts as a trading off that a policymaker might have between these competing objectives. The final term is exponential, and this acts as a binding constraint. So we're going to severely punish any control strategies whose peak hospital emissions exceed a predetermined capacity, HC. So this was particularly useful for me when I was calibrating the thresholds in the first place. As a policymaker, realistically, will not willingly implement a strategy that overwhelms the NHS. So this is an outline of what the strategies look like dynamically in the absence of vaccination. So in red, I have the period spent in lockdown, yellow is the period spent in intermediate control, and yellow is the period spent in no control. And then on the left, I have the current number of people in hospital with severe disease. And then on the right, I show what that looks like cumulatively. So just to demonstrate the messages, in cautious easing, you've that high threshold to enter lockdown. So you only have that one phase. We want to minimize the number of lockdowns. With suppression, we've that lower prevalence due to the lower switching thresholds at the cost of continually maintaining the two NPIs. Slow control, we've two shorter periods of lockdown, but after we relax, we avoid any exponential growth in the intermediate control state. And we only get those further, less severe waves because we try to fully relax. And then finally, rapid control, narrow gaps between moderately high switching thresholds. We're consistently returning back to no control and fully relaxing, but as a consequence, the prevalence is higher throughout the outbreak. So then I'll introduce my vaccine protocol. So we're going to assume this is an urgency for the policymaker to implement as soon as possible. But since it's a novel outbreak, it's going to be subject to supply constraints. So again, with the recent COVID pandemic, we're going to model cumulative vaccinations in the form of something like a logistic function where there's a bottleneck and then there's a rapid increase. And we're also going to have a staggered approach. So we're vaccinating the most vulnerable age group first, and then working our way down the age groups. So the two key parameters in my vaccination function is capital T, which is the arrival date of the vaccine, and eta, which is an eventual coverage and or proxy for efficacy. So we could stratify this further to model different efficacies in transmission, severe disease, hospitalizations, deaths, but this would drastically increase the dimension of uncertainty in the problem. And eta does a good job at modeling different vaccine strengths and dynamics. So I'm going to let these two parameters be Poisson random variables, and I'm going to combine marginal distributions to get this discrete joint probability distribution for various vaccine outcomes. So this one on the top right, is expecting a prompt vaccine arrival time with a high eventual coverage. So that one is quite optimistic in contrast to the other vaccine outcomes. So when we incorporate vaccination, the optimal control strategy is going to be contingent on our weighting coefficient W in the objective function. So higher W means we prioritize reducing health costs more. And it's also going to depend on our two vaccine variables. So here I'm going to keep eta fixed at some values and I'm going to vary t, and I'll do the converse on the next slide. So we have a three-dimensional surface plot for the cost surface of each control strategy, and cost is increasing downward. So the optimal strategy is viewed from a bird's eye point of view, which I show on the right-hand side. So it's important to get a grasp of both, because purely viewing the optimal hides what's happening at the suboptimal level and switching where things become weakly dominant to weakly subdominant as well. So what I'll point out here is as we increase eta, if you look at early vaccine arrival times on the right, then the suppression strategy starts to win out for lower values of W. Despite us, when we lower W, we are prioritizing the reduction in control costs. So this is more of a justification for more stringent control policies in the short term. So if we think the vaccine's going to arrive soon and we think it's going to be effective, then that net benefit we get at reducing disease costs will win out, because once the vaccine arrives, if it's effective, for all strategies, the disease burden will be lower. So again, there's instances there where the slow control strategy starts to win out. But if you refer back to the surface plots, this is a very marginal effect over the rapid control strategy. And then something similar happens when I vary eta and fix t at certain values. So as we move down, our vaccine's arriving sooner, good, and the suppression strategy starts to become more effective. So now I'm going to introduce the underlying distribution. So there's a lot going on here. So on the left column, I have our different vaccine outcome distributions. The optimistic one is that second row there. And using these distributions, I'm going to compute the expected cost of each control strategy. So that's the scatters in the center plots, as well as some uncertainty, so they're credible intervals. And this time, cost is increasing upwards. So the optimal strategy is viewed from the bottom. We want to minimize cost. So what happens here is for that, again, for that optimistic vaccine distribution, the frontier where suppression starts to win out occurs for lower values of W. And then on the right-hand side, what I'm plotting is the probability that each strategy is optimal, which is again, highly contingent on how you prioritize various trade-offs in your objective function. And then I'll also note that that second row is the only one that seems to reduce costs significantly for all outcomes. So that third row is the pessimistic one where T is high and eta is low. And then if you compare the top and bottom, costs are largely the same. So what that tells me is that both variables are necessary to optimize in order to significantly reduce costs. So this graph is quite similar as well, but again, on the right-hand side, I'm now plotting the probability each strategy has the highest cost. And this is a lot more simpler to identify. So suppression and rapid control in our subset of control strategies are the two extremes. Suppression, lowest prevalence, highest control, rapid control, the opposite. And when we look at the greatest cost, these are associated with high uncertainty. So there is some degree of risk that these are the worst outcomes. So in the context of suppression, if it's all well and good if the vaccine arrives early, but if we are waiting indefinitely long for the vaccine to arrive, it's going to accumulate those expensive control costs. So that leads me to the question, given a distribution of costs for each control strategy, how do we go about defining an optimal? So we could compute the expected cost of each strategy and compare the expectations or the mean. We can choose to optimize against the most likely outcome, so say the mode of our underlying distribution, or in the context of significant uncertainty like the recent pandemic, we might be interested in minimizing a reasonable worst case scenario. So I've listed some potential ranking criteria on the left, and I have a demonstration of those strategy rankings on the right. And most importantly, both switching at the optimal and suboptimal level is different for different strategies. So policymakers need to be clear at identifying risk levels when they come to ranking strategies, because they are likely to come across uncertainty in their outcomes. So I've also mentioned there that there's formal decision rules that exist for epistemic or between model uncertainty. So it's something I'd like to apply in the future, as well as other metrics. So just to wrap up, we've kind of constructed this model and control framework to demonstrate this proof of concept that objectives do matter. And the optimal control strategy is contingent on a known policymaker's objectives. So it's also going to vary as we consider different beliefs about when the vaccine is going to arrive and how effective it will be. And this influences our decision of the optimal to adopt at the beginning of the outbreak. And then we also raised the question of what do you do when there is uncertainty in your cost output? So does one always minimize against the expected cost, or given significant uncertainty and the risk of catastrophic outcomes, does one minimize against a reasonable worst case scenario? And under what conditions does one policymaker choose a ranking criteria over the other? So then just pointing out some future work I'd like to do. I really want to tease out the cost of control in my objective function, particularly as I consider different NPIs. I've currently been considering what I'm going to call a blanket NPI. They might have different cost profiles. So if you think about mask wearing, they might have a very high cost upfront if you're trying to stockpile them, but then they're not that expensive to implement continuously, which can't be said for something like the closure of schools, which could have a completely unprecedented long-term cost that would be very difficult to model. I want to compare different mechanisms for introducing the NPIs. So I base my strategies and my switching thresholds based off of prevalence in hospital. The problem with that is that there is a delay between you switching your control policy and actually observing the peak in hospitalizations. So you need to take into account how long that delay is when you're setting your thresholds. So that threshold to enter lockdown can't be too near your real hospital capacity. It has to be some diminished fraction of it. And then lastly, I'm using these 4 distinct strategies to outline a different principle behind them and make that clear. But in general, given a known objective function, we could always use numerical optimization methods to find a precise combination of thresholds that would give us an optimal or minimal cost. So thank you.